hope at the bus stop. God still meets people in ordinary places. Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you. There are seasons of life where waiting quietly becomes part of your personality. You stop announcing plans confidently. You stop explaining things fully. You stop expecting people to understand. Because after a while, disappointment teaches people how to speak softly around themselves. And sometimes the hardest thing is not even the lack, it is waking up every morning trying to keep hope alive when nothing around you seems to be moving. This is the story of Emeka, a young man in Enugu, a bus stop, a long season of waiting. And the quiet ways God continued speaking even when life looked still. The rain began before dawn, soft rain, the kind that settled gently on rooftops and roads without urgency. By morning, Enugu carried that familiar wet glow that came after early rain. Water gathered beside broken gutters. Mist rested faintly above distant hills, while the city slowly stretched awake beneath gray skies. Conductors shouted destinations into the cold air. Khaki horns echoed through narrow streets. Women arranged akara beside steaming oil. A church loudspeaker played morning prayers faintly from somewhere behind the next compound. Life was beginning again, whether people were ready or not. Inside a small room with fading cream-colored walls, Emeka sat at the edge of his mattress staring at his phone screen. 6:14 a.m. No emails, no missed calls, no alerts, just the pale glow reflecting against tired eyes. The room smelled faintly of damp walls and detergent soap. Near the corner stood a standing fan that only rotated properly when pushed manually. Beside the wardrobe hung the shirt he planned to wear, light blue, long sleeve, carefully ironed the previous night, because after 3 years without stable work, dignity had become one of the few things Emeka still fought to preserve. His mother knocked softly before opening the door halfway. You are awake? Yes, ma. She entered carrying tea and bread on a small tray. Steam rose gently from the cup. You should eat before leaving. I'll buy something outside. You said that yesterday too. Emeka smiled faintly, the kind of smile people use when both sides already know the truth. There was no money to buy anything outside. 3 years of applications, interviews, online certifications, promises, silence. At first, everybody encouraged him. You're intelligent. Something big will come. Just be patient. But encouragement changes tone when time passes. Now relatives ask questions more carefully. Neighbors stopped asking entirely. Even his father had reduced career conversations during dinner, not out of wickedness, out of helplessness. That morning's interview lasted 11 minutes. The receptionist barely looked at him properly. A man in a striped shirt asked routine questions while typing lazily on his laptop. Any work experience? What value can you add? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? 5 years at that point. Even 5 months felt difficult to picture clearly. We'll get back to you again. The same sentence. Polite, professional, empty. Outside, rain fell softly across the city. Cars hissed through wet roads. Students laughed near a pharmacy. A roadside woman fanned smoke into the air above roasting corn. Life moved confidently around you. And somehow that made everything worse. Without planning to, Emeka eventually reached the old bus stop near Ogi Road. The shelter roof leaned slightly to one side. Rust stains stretched along the edges. Rainwater dripped steadily near the corner. A concrete bench sat beneath it, worn smooth by years of waiting bodies, waiting for buses, waiting for people, waiting for life to move. A woman adjusted vegetables beside the gutter. A conductor shouted, Abakpa. One seat, a little boy chased a bus, holding bottled water in both hands. An old woman prayed softly with rosary beads beneath the shelter. The city kept moving. His phone vibrated suddenly. Chinadu, how far? Any good news? Emeka locked the screen immediately. He did not have energy for hopeful conversations anymore. The rain softened into tiny drifting drops. Beneath that leaking shelter, something heavy shifted inside him. Not anger, not sadness. Exactly, fear. The quiet fear that maybe his life would never really begin. He lowered his head slowly, and for the first time in months, he prayed honestly, not polished prayer, not church prayer, just honesty. God, I'm tired. Young man. Emeka looked up. An elderly man stood beside the bench holding an old umbrella and nylon bag. Can I sit? Yes, sir. The old man lowered himself carefully. This rain, no one rests today. Emeka smiled faintly. For some minutes, neither of them spoke. They simply watched the wet road together. Conductors shouting, KK engines rattling, rainwater moving beside gutters, smoke rising from roasted corn nearby. The smell mixing with wet earth. Then the old man glanced sideways. You look like somebody carrying bad news. Emeka laughed quietly through his nose. Not because it was funny, because it was true, job hunting. Emeka nodded. How long? 3 years. The old man remained quiet. No pity, no exaggerated surprise. Just understanding, and somehow that made talking easier. I studied hard, Emeka said softly. I did everything they told us to do good grades, skills, applications, interviews. His voice lowered. I just thought life would move by now. The old man watched the road silently, then finally spoke. When I finished school, I stayed home 4 years. Emeka looked up immediately. The old man smiled faintly. Then my mates had traveled. Some got married. One stopped greeting me because he thought I had become a failure. He chuckled softly, but listened carefully. He pointed toward the buses moving through rain. Delay is painful, but delay and abandonment are not the same thing. The sentence settled deeply inside Emeka, not like motivation, like truth. The old man reached into his nylon bag and brought out roasted corn wrapped in newspaper. He broke it in half. Take, thank you, sir. They ate quietly beneath the leaking shelter while Enugu carried on around them. Then, before entering his bus, the old man turned back once more. Don't let waiting convince you that God forgot your address. That night, Emeka kept hearing the sentence repeatedly, but the next morning, nothing changed. He still woke up unemployed, still uncertain, still carrying unanswered questions, and life remained difficult. The rainy season slowly faded. The roads dried, dust returned to the city. The Christmas decorations began appearing outside supermarkets and phone shops. Life moved forward again. But Emeka remained suspended somewhere behind it. One afternoon, after another rejected interview, he sat beneath the same bus stop shelter again. The roasted corn woman looked at him briefly, while arranging charcoal beneath her stand. You dey here often, she said casually. Emeka laughed softly. Life no gree me rest, she shook her head. Ego better. Simple words, ordinary words. But somehow they stayed with him the whole evening. One morning, his father called him aside before leaving for work. The old man adjusted his wristwatch slowly before speaking. I know things are difficult. Emeka nodded quietly. His father hesitated. They then added softly, but don't disappear into discouragement. That sentence hit harder than shouting would have. Around that same period, Emeka discovered a free online logistics certification course. The cyber cafe owner near their junction allowed him sit longer some evenings. After noticing how serious he was, you fit lock up when you finish, the man once joked. Emeka smiled. Little kindnesses had started mattering more now. Power outages became frequent again. Most nights, the compound hummed with distant generators while darkness settled heavily across the street. One evening during blackout, his mother sat beside him outside while folding clothes. You know your father and I prayed with Jeremiah 29:11 during our first year of marriage, she said softly, though we didn't know where rent would come from. She smiled faintly. Sometimes God's plans, don't look like plans while you're inside them. Later that night, unable to sleep, Emeka searched for the scripture again on his phone. For I know the plans I have for you. The screen glow reflected softly against the dark room. He stared at the verse quietly, not because all doubts disappeared, but because for the first time in a long while, the future no longer felt completely empty. One afternoon, Emeka spent his last transport money attending an interview, only to discover the position had already been filled internally. He walked nearly an hour back toward town, hungry, tired, ashamed. At the bus stop that evening, the conductor with a cracked voice recognized him. Chairman, the man joked loudly. You never travel finish? People laughed lightly nearby. Emeka forced a smile. But later that night, he cried quietly after everyone slept. One Sunday morning, Emeka almost did not go to church. But his mother insisted. During the sermon, the pastor suddenly read Jeremiah 29:11. Not dramatically, just in passing. Yet Emeka felt something tighten inside him. The pastor said softly, sometimes the hardest thing about God's plan is living through the middle of it. Emeka lowered his head immediately because somehow that was exactly where he was living. The middle, the after service. A church member who owned a small logistics company asked casually, you still interested in supply chain work? Yes, sir. Come around sometime. Maybe you can assist part-time. It was unpaid initially, just helping with inventory and delivery coordination. But Emeka accepted immediately. The work was tiring, long hours, no salary sometimes, only transport money. But slowly, Emeka began learning practical things no online course had taught him. Inventory software, delivery tracking, warehouse coordination, customer management. One evening while closing late, his supervisor looked over at him. You learn fast. Emeka looked away slightly. It had been a long time since someone complimented his future instead of pitying his situation. They at home. His younger brother started sitting beside him some evenings asking questions about computers and logistics. Quiet respect had started growing where pity once lived. The rains returned again, softly at first, then fully, and somehow the city looked exactly like it had 7 months earlier when he first met the old man. One Tuesday afternoon, while helping his mother arrange goods outside the house, his phone rang. Unknown number, he almost ignored it. Almost, hello, am I speaking with Emeka Okafor? Yes, this is Eastern Axis Logistics. His chest tightened immediately. We received your updated application and certification records. Rain clouds gathered softly above the street again. His mother looked toward him from the doorway instinctively. We would like you to come in tomorrow for final assessment and onboarding consideration. For a moment, Emeka said nothing, not because he did not hear, because after years of disappointment, hope had started sounding dangerous. That evening, the atmosphere inside the house changed quietly, not celebration, carefulness. The kind families were when they are afraid to become hopeful too quickly. His mother cooked rice that night, even though it was not month end. His younger brother kept asking questions. What kind of company is it? Will you travel? Do they pay well? Even his father, who usually spoke carefully around career discussions now, asked softly, what time should you leave tomorrow? Later that evening, his mother entered his room holding a neatly folded shirt inside transparent nylon. I bought this from Okpara Avenue last week, she said. Emeka looked up immediately. The shirt was ash-colored, long sleeve, simple, clearly second-hand, but still neat. The sleeves slightly longer than his hands. The collar stiff from careful washing and ironing. Mama, Shey interview no deserve better shirt, she replied softly before he could finish. Emeka touched the fabric quietly. For some reason, emotion rose suddenly inside his chest. Not because of the shirt itself, because he knew his mother probably sacrificed something small to buy it. That night, rain tapped softly against the zinc roofing outside. The compound generator hummed briefly before going silent again. Emeka sat on the edge of his bed, checking his documents repeatedly. CV, certificates, passport photographs, photocopies, everything arranged carefully inside the black file, whose edges had already softened from years of movement. Near midnight, he still could not sleep properly. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind replayed possibilities. What if this becomes another disappointment? What if he says the wrong thing? What if they already have someone else internally? What if hope embarrasses him again? He reached for his phone, slowly opened the Bible app. The Jeremiah 29:11 was still there from the last time he read it. The screen glow reflected softly against the dark room. For I know the plans I have for you. Emeka stared quietly at the verse, then whispered softly into the darkness, please let this one count. By 5:30 a.m., he was already awake. The rain had stopped. Cold, early morning air drifted through the window. Enugu had not fully woken yet. Distant kick sounds echoed faintly through the street, while women swept compound fronts with long brooms. His mother was already in the kitchen. The smell of tea and fried egg floated softly through the house. When Emeka stepped out wearing the ash-colored shirt and dark trousers, she paused briefly and smiled. You look responsible, she said quietly. His younger brother grinned immediately. The chairman logistics. Everybody laughed softly, even his father, and somehow that small laughter loosened something inside the house. Before leaving, his father stopped him near the door. Not dramatic, just simple. The old man placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. Go and do your best. Then, after a pause, and don't reduce yourself inside that room. The cake ride into town felt different that morning. Not easier, heavier, because this time something real was at stake emotionally. The roads still carried puddles from the previous night's rain. School children waited beside the junctions. Conductors shouted destinations. Street vendors arranged oranges beneath umbrellas. But this time, Emeka noticed himself watching everything carefully, like someone trying to memorize a version of life before it changes. Eastern Axis Logistics occupied the third floor of a modern, glass-fronted building near Independence Layout. When Emeka entered the reception area, 6 other candidates were already seated. Everybody looked polished. Sharp shoes, expensive wristwatches, confident posture. One man typed rapidly on a laptop, while another spoke fluent corporate English on the phone. For a moment, old insecurity returned immediately. Maybe he still wasn't enough. Maybe he came too far behind everybody else. Then his phone vibrated softly inside his pocket. His mother. One message. Jeremiah 29:11. Nothing else, just that. Emeka inhaled slowly, then sat up properly in his chair. The assessment began around 10 a.m. Computer tests first. The inventory, calculations, tracking systems, warehouse, simulations, data entry, speed tests. Then practical problem-solving scenarios. At first, his hands trembled slightly on the keyboard, but gradually something surprising began happening. The months at the small logistics company, the unpaid work, the late-night learning, the borrowed data, the cyber cafe practice sessions. All of it began surfacing naturally. For the first time in years, Emeka did not feel completely behind. During one exercise, a supervisor paused behind him longer than expected. You've worked with logistics software before? Yes, sir. Where? A small warehouse operation in town. The supervisor nodded slowly. You learned fast, those same words again. Only this time, inside a room that could actually change his future. Hours passed. Interviews, panel discussions, waiting, more waiting. At one point, Emeka sat alone along the corridor outside the conference room, while rain began falling lightly against the building windows again. He watched droplets slide slowly down the glass, then quietly opened Jeremiah 29:11, once more on his phone. Not dramatically, just quietly, like someone holding on to something fragile. Finally, sometime after 4 p.m., the last interviewer closed the file and looked toward him. We're impressed with your growth, not perfection. Growth, the word settled deeply. Then came the familiar sentence again. We'll contact you, and suddenly fear returned because now he wanted this badly, too badly. The journey home felt longer that evening. The city looked blurred behind rain-stained cake covers. Traffic lights reflected against wet roads. Conductors still shouted destinations into evening air. But this time, Emeka's silence carried tension instead of emptiness. Days passed, 1 week, then two, then three, no call, nothing, and slowly disappointment started returning again, quietly. One evening, he found himself back beneath the old rusted shelter near Ogi Road. The roasted corn woman was still there, the same conductor still shouting with his cracked voice, rainwater still rolling beside gutters, the same concrete bench, the same movement. Emeka sat quietly staring at the road while buses arrived and left. Maybe this one too had ended in silence. Maybe hope had spoken too early again. Then suddenly, his phone rang, unknown number. This time, his chest tightened so hard, he almost missed the call. He answered immediately. Hello, Mr. Emeka? Yes. A brief pause. Then, we are pleased to inform you that you've been selected. For a moment, the sound around him disappeared. The buses, the rain, the conductors, everything faded beneath the sudden weight, pressing against his chest. He lowered his head slowly, and without realizing it, he began to cry. Quietly, right there beneath the rusted shelter. Not loud tears, the kind that come from carrying something heavy. For too long, the roasted corn woman noticed him first. You don't get she asked carefully. Emeka laughed through tears and nodded. Yes. The woman smiled immediately. Rain continued falling softly across Enugu. Conductors still shouted destinations, cars still splashed through puddles. The city kept moving normally. But for Emeka, something had finally changed. And sitting there beneath that familiar shelter, with Jeremiah 29:11 glowing softly on his cracked phone screen, Emeka finally understood God had not forgotten his address after all. The phone call sat heavily in Emeka's chest long after it ended. The noise of the bus stop suddenly felt distant. Conductors still shouted destinations. The roasted corn seller still turned the corn slowly over charcoal. Rainwater still reflected headlights on the wet road, but Emeka could barely hear any of it anymore. He remained seated for a few seconds, holding the phone tightly in his hand, trying to process the words he had just heard. We are pleased to inform you after months of rejection, after silent tears, after awkward interviews, after pretending to be strong for his family, something had finally changed. His breathing became uneven, not because the job was big, not because life had suddenly become perfect, but because hope had finally answered back. He slowly stood up from the concrete bench, looking around the same bus stop where he had once prayed quietly in frustration. The same place, the same rain, the same city, but not the same Emeka anymore. As he entered the keke, heading home, he stared outside quietly the entire ride. School children crossed muddy roads. Market women arranged tomatoes beneath umbrellas. Conductors argued over passengers. Life was moving normally, yet inside him everything had changed. When Emeka finally reached home, the compound was calm. Light from the kitchen spilled softly into the small corridor. His mother was inside preparing evening tea. His younger brother sat nearby scrolling through his phone lazily. The door opened gently. His mother looked up immediately. The mama. Emeka called softly. Something in his voice made her pause. She stepped out from the kitchen slowly, searching his face. For a moment, he couldn't speak. All the pressure, the waiting, the fear, the silent prayers, they gathered in his throat at once. Then finally, with trembling relief, he smiled faintly and said, "Mama, they called me." Silence. His mother blinked once, almost afraid to ask. The job. Emeka nodded slowly. That was all she needed. Her hand flew to her chest immediately. Chai, God. Tears filled her eyes before words could come. The younger brother jumped to his feet instantly. Bro, serious? Emeka laughed softly through emotional eyes and nodded again. Suddenly, the small house changed. The tension that had lived there for months loosened all at once. His mother held his hands tightly, shaking her head in disbelief. I told you God had not forgotten you. Even his father, usually quiet and restrained, stood silently near the doorway with proud eyes. No loud celebration, no dramatic shouting, just relief. Deep, quiet, holy relief. That night, the small family ate dinner differently. The room still looked the same, the walls were still old. The furniture was still modest, but hope had returned to the house. Sometimes God does not meet people first in breakthroughs. Sometimes He meets them in waiting seasons, at bus stops, inside tired prayers, inside ordinary conversations, inside long delays that quietly shape who we are becoming. And if you are in a season where life feels paused, please remember delay is painful. But delay and abandonment are not the same thing. If this story spoke to you, share it with someone who may be waiting silently for hope again. And subscribe to Abiding Stream for more stories where everyday life meets the living Word of God.